Hey, greetings everybody, Gleekon here again with another episode of Lore of Warcraft. On our last episode, we kind of joined battle, the big final epic showdown between the five future dragon aspects in Galakrond, and it's going okay. So stay a while and listen as we continue this one. This is the penultimate chapter of the series. It's chapter 4 of part 5. It's called The Five. Here we go. Jaina knelt between Kalak and the artifact, caught between the knowledge that she needed to work fast to save the blue dragon, and the great desire to hold and comfort him if these were to be his last minutes, no matter what she attempted. Kalak continued his grisly metamorphosis, the proto-dragon elements far more pronounced, and the rate of his breathing so rapid that the Archmage could not believe that his lungs had not already exploded. This can't be what this device was meant for, Jaina insisted to herself. It makes no sense. That's what I thought. I just feel like people haven't taken it far enough. She concentrated on the pulsating artifact. Her eyes widened as she noticed that what she had believed to be a single solid object actually had two components. He found something, Bunique had said. Bunique, who could vanish without a trace even when very near the Archmage. But no sooner had she started to make some connection between the mysterious Tonka and the discovery of the second part than Jaina felt as if someone watched her. The spellcaster quickly looked up beyond the artifact. There was no one there, or rather, no one there now. Yet a peculiar thought ran through Jaina's mind, the thought that she had seen someone. Not a dragon and not a human, but something closer to the latter in shape. As she concentrated, the Archmage imagined that it had been a cloaked and hooded figure a bit taller than even Kalak in his humanoid form. Jaina knew something of keepers, and while they were much taller, like giants actually, she was certain that they had the power to make themselves be seen otherwise. Yet even if that was the case, if she had seen some keeper image, Jaina wondered why it had faded away so quickly. I didn't imagine it. It stood there. And it had not appeared until Jaina had begun to investigate the fact that there were two components to the artifact, not one. That also brought her back to Bunique, whom she increasingly considered something other than a Tonka. It would not be difficult for a keeper to take on such an illusion either. Certain that she had come upon the right track, Jaina investigated where the two pieces looked as if they were fused together. Had it not been for her expert eye, the Archmage doubted that she would have noticed. Moreover, they were also blended together by spellwork. Spellwork. Jaina thought again of how she had first confronted the artifact. Perhaps her attack had been too broad for this part of the situation. Recreating the symbol, she studied the bonds between the two components, then cast. The image draped over the smaller part and thus where it was sealed to the larger. As that took place, Jaina reinforced her personal spells yet again. She had no idea what might happen, but experience had taught her to expect the worst. Both parts flared white, blinding her. The Archmage fell back, certain that the relic was about to either explode or strike hard against her. Instead, the bright illumination faded, and the smaller component turned half a circle. Blinking, Jaina tentatively reached for it. A stream of white energy struck her forehead. She jolted, but out of surprise, not pain. And suddenly, Jaina saw. The world rippled. It did so in a manner Kalak had not experienced before. He felt as if one moment washed over another like waves in the sea. It was disconcerting, even more so because everything he viewed through Malagos's eyes flowed on just like waves too. The mist drew closer and closer, Galakrond behind it. And when Malagos glanced back at the undead, it was the same. As if made of water, they spilled toward him, an image that only served to make them even ghastlier. We are going to die, Kalak thought with both dread and wonder. He had not believed that Malagos could die, but his memories of his own time had grown so vague that Kalak wondered if they were memories at all or merely fancies. But that hardly mattered. All that mattered was that he and his host were about to perish in some gruesome manner. A mournful roar interrupted Kalak's thoughts and drew Malagos's notice. The icy blue veil turned to the sound. Something else had drawn Galakrond's attention, a pitiful but still fiery plume exhaled by a straining Alexstrasza. Behind her, Neltharion, once powerful Neltharion, struggled just to stay aloft. It was immediately clear that Alexstrasza wanted Neltharion to fly off, but he fought to stay near as if he could help. Galakrond sneered. Malagos forgotten for the moment, the behemoth exhaled lightly at Alexstrasza, sending another gust of his foul mist over her. What fight the fire-orange female had managed to draw up faded. Worse, in her struggle to keep her wings flapping, Alexstrasza drifted toward her gigantic foe. Galakrond opened his mouth wide. He waited with amusement as Alexstrasza unwittingly continued toward the massive jaws. Malygos threw himself forward, choosing the mist over the undead. Kalik was glad for his choice, even as the mist began sapping both their wills, for at least the rippling ceased as soon as that happened. Whatever their fates, the five had shown themselves to be as loyal to one another as any true dragon. Each had tried to save one or more of the others, never shirking, never fearful of death. No, not 5. 4. The thought faded with all others as the mist proved too great for Malygos. His charge had turned out to be as futile as Talonyx's grand one. His wings slowed. It was all he could do to force them to move fast enough to keep him from falling to his death, which meant that there was nothing he could do for either Neltharion or, more eminently, Alexstrasza. As Malygos and Kalik's own struggle worsened, they saw that the fire-orange female registered her doom. She managed a few flaps that slowed her, but already the jaws began to close on her. Something dropped onto Galakrond near the side, blinded by Alexstrasza's earlier attack. It landed hard, and as it did, a great gust of sand swept over the gargantuan proto-dragon's head, blanketing it. Kalik and his host, vaguely made out of battered Nosdormu, fighting for a hold as he exhaled again and again. Galakrond sought to shake Nosdormu off. The brown proto-dragon flopped back and forth but kept claws secured. Nosdormu looked very weak in that he had somehow managed to return to attack Galakrond anew, amazed Malygos and Kalik. But what appeared to be hope for Alexstrasza faded, as Galakrond, clearly seeing Nosdormu as more of a nuisance, once more concentrated his focus on her. The respite had not been enough to allow her any true chance of escape. It didn't even help that, in trying to rid himself of Nosdormu, the monstrous Leviathan had forced away much of the mist. Having inhaled so much of it, Alexstrasza, like Malygos and Neltharion, could not recover in time. Nosdormu let loose with one last blast of sand. It slammed into Galakrond's brow, but as hard as it hit, it was already evident that the blow would not even distract the horrific foe for more than another breath. Yet that was not Nosdormu's full intention. For barely had he brought Galakrond's attention toward him when the blast shifted downward and clogged the huge proto-dragon's nostrils. Galakrond instinctively opened his maw wider in search of air, and in that critical moment, a slighter yellowish female proto-dragon placed herself before Galakrond and exhaled into his mouth. He pulled back his head, his expression peculiar. As the mist faded from Malygos and Kalik, they recalled the effect of Ysera's breath weapon, in some ways akin to that of Galakrond, if not so debilitating. Ysera did not go to Alexstrasza, as Malygos had assumed. Instead, she did the unthinkable again, and continued her mad assault on Galakrond, all the while keeping herself between him and her sister. Kalik and his host saw that they had underestimated Ysera. Perhaps she had been hesitant in her role, but she had not abandoned Alexstrasza or the rest of them. Indeed, it became clear that Ysera had been the one to aid the injured Nosdormu in reaching Galakrond, and that Nosdormu's attacks had all been designed as feints for Ysera, and perhaps unintentionally, Malygos. His mind clear, the icy blue male knew that they would not have another chance. Galakrond hovered, disoriented, but that would not last much longer. If Malygos could... A hiss warned him of a threat that he had forgotten. Yet when Malygos turned to face the undead, he found them flying even more haphazardly, and in one case, fighting each other. At first perplexed, Malygos realized that Galakrond's disorientation had affected his rotting slaves. Malygos exhaled on the fighting pair, sending them falling frozen together. He wanted to deal with the rest, but Ysera's warning roar brought him back to Galakrond. Alexstrasza's sister raced about Galakrond's head, exhaling into the monster's mouth and slashing with her claws elsewhere. Her adversary kept shaking his head in what seemed irritation, but was still a need to clear his mind of the effects of her breath weapon. Malygos admired Ysera's efforts thus far, but could not help noticing that Galakrond's eyes were becoming more focused. Worse, with a great snort, he finally managed to force the sand from his nostrils, at which point he inhaled huge gasps of air to help speed his recovery. But in observing all this, Malygos forged a plan. It was akin to a past attack they had tried against Galakrond, but in that attempt they had fought more as individuals and not as one. Moreover, Galakrond had not been as huge as he currently was. If the five could do as Malygos had earlier dreamed, He rushed to Neltharion, who had at last shaken off his own stupor. "Come, hurry!" To his credit, the charcoal gray male followed without hesitation. Malygos soared to one of the peaks shattered in the struggle. Huge, jagged chunks of stone clung precariously to the mountains, of which they had once been wholly a part. Malygos eyed the largest and sharpest one that 2 proto-dragons could possibly carry with their hindpaws. "Help me!" Between Neltharion and him, they broke the fragment free. Malygos guided them back to a path toward Galakrond. As the behemoth came into sight, Malygos saw that Alexstrasza had done as he thought she would. The instant her head had cleared, she had gone to stand with her sister. Now the pair flew in from opposing sides, moving almost as if reading each other's thoughts. They struck simultaneously, keeping Galakrond from choosing one victim over the other. In the process, they also served to prevent him from noticing the 2 males' approach. But while the sisters and Galakrond saw only one another, Nosdormu caught sight of Malygos and Neltharion. He also saw the rock they brought with him. Whether or not Nosdormu understood just what they planned to do with it, he evidently realized that they needed to get much closer. Throwing himself up from the relative safety of his current position, the brown proto-dragon managed another exhalation. The column caught the top of Galakrond's brow ridge, causing him to look down instinctively, as he had before. As he did that, Alexstrasza and Ysera increased their own assault, now alternating so that, as he raised his head again, Galakrond remained concerned only with them. But just as it seemed things were at last coming together, Neltharion roared, "Not living!" Twisting his neck hard, Malygos discovered some of the undead almost nipping at their tails. The creatures did not fly with the relative coordination that they'd first had, which to both Kalik and his host revealed that Galakrond had completely released his hold on them. Whether he had done so intentionally or simply because he had become too distracted to maintain any link could not be said. What did matter was that the animated corpses had returned to whatever passed for their instinct and were flying after the closest potential meals. And with Malygos and Neltharion carrying a heavy burden between them, the 2 males looked like very easy meals. "Neltharion is strong," Malygos roared, a desperate addition to the plan hatching. "Neltharion could carry this stone by himself." The charcoal gray proto-dragon's eyes narrowed. "Neltharion is strong. So is Malygos. And smarter than Neltharion." Neltharion opened one paw. The rock shifted. Without thinking, Malygos tightened his own grip. He knew what Neltharion intended. It was what he himself had been about to do, but it was already too late to stop the other proto-dragon. Neltharion released his remaining hold. Malygos grunted from effort as he fought to keep the rock from slipping free. Kalik knew that Malygos had intended to ask Neltharion to carry the rock while the icy blue male went back to face the undead. It was not that Malygos thought fighting Galakrond's puppets was easier. In some ways it merely offered a more immediate and just as grisly death. But Neltharion knew what Kalik also knew about Malygos. For the plan against Galakrond to succeed, Malygos had to coordinate it. Neltharion was a fearsome fighter, the strongest of the 5, but he was not the planner, Malygos was. At least not yet, Kalik abruptly recalled. As Deathwing, Neltharion proved far too cunning. But that's in the future, I think. As Kalik battled with himself over whether or not there was a future, Malygos took one last glance at Neltharion, who at that moment barreled into 3 of the encroaching undead. Then steeling himself, Malygos faced Galakrond. Inhaling deeply, Kalik's host pushed harder. He could not prevent Neltharion's likely death, but he could help make that sacrifice count, even if he and the others also had to sacrifice themselves to do that. And as Malygos closed on the deformed Leviathan, he felt very certain that they would have to. Galakrond chose that moment to twist to the side. He snapped at Ysera, the huge fangs coming within a few feet of her. She backed up as quickly as she could, but Galakrond continued to pursue her, his jaws again opening. Fire scorched near his eye. Alexstrasza exhaled twice, attempting to draw his attention to her. However, Galakrond ignored the minor pain she caused. To Malygos' shock, and probably that of everyone else, including Galakrond, Ysera reversed direction. She flew into the opening maw, then immediately rose, her hind paws pulled forward, and her own jaws opened. Her mad action served to make Alexstrasza continue to exhale, even though she fought for breath each time. The flames rained over the entire side of Galakrond's scaled countenance. Extraneous limbs twisted, sizzled, and withered under the onslaught, so much so that it did cause Galakrond to roar in pain. As his mouth then widened, Ysera scraped her claws across the blackened flesh inside the top. Blood and pus poured forth from the sorely wounded area. Ignoring the fluid spilling over her, the yellowish female took a savage bite from the same flesh before turning away. Galakrond's roar trebled. He snapped shut his jaws, but by then the impetuous Ysera had just made her escape. Seeing Galakrond clamp his jaws, Malygos feared for his own plan, but then his gargantuan foe opened his mouth wide once more. Galakrond hacked and coughed, and for a moment looked slightly smaller. "He's weakened," Malygos thought, "but not for long. But he is weakened." Kalik knew most of Malygos' plan by this time, but that knowledge did not encourage him. Nor did it encourage him to have his host, flying as fast as he could with such a tremendous burden, into the very maw from which Ysera had just barely escaped. Galakrond sniffed the air. He turned toward Malygos. Nosdormu blasted the nearer eye with sand. Neither Malygos nor the monster had seen Nosdormu closing, the brown proto-dragon timing his attacks perfectly as usual. Galakrond tilted his head away from the irritating sand, which gave Malygos the opening he needed. The icy blue female flew under the upper fangs and into a place that stank, not only from the ravaged flesh, but also from the breath of the ultimate carnivore to stride across the young world. Both Malygos and Kalik tried not to think of just how many proto-dragons had gone down that much too close gullet. Malygos' grip slipped. His exertions had finally taken their toll. He felt the rock almost fall free. Struggling to keep what grasp he had, Malygos pushed on toward the frightening gap. All Galakrond had to do was shut his mouth and swallow, and that would be the end of the tinier proto-dragon. "No!" Kalik silently shouted at his host. "No!" But Malygos kept on a second longer. He sought just the right angle. Darkness enveloped Kalik, but this time it was the darkness of Galakrond's jaws closing. Releasing his hold, Malygos banked. Neither could see the rock's descent, but they knew the results of it in the next breath. Galakrond's jaws shot open yet again, and new hacking almost deafened Kalik and his host. Taking the chance that he might be bitten in two just like Talanixa, Malygos darted out the side. However, it appeared that he need not have feared being bitten, for Galakrond continued to cough, this time for another reason. As Malygos had planned and hoped, the rock he had chosen, a large pointed projectile, had slid down deep into the behemoth's throat. There it lodged, cutting off most of Galakrond's breathing. The enormous proto-dragon thrashed in the sky. His tail shattered part of a mountainside. One hindpaw kicked tons of stone from another. Still unable to dislodge the rock, Galakrond collided with a mountain. Rather than flying into the air again, he swiftly crawled over it. His claws and tail left devastation in their wake. Leaning over a valley, Galakrond lowered his head. He shook it back and forth hard. "He will free himself." Malygos had hoped that the rock would remain lodged enough at least to make their adversary collapse, preferably die. Now he worried that Galakrond still had a very good chance of freeing his air passage. If that happened, Malygos doubted he would get the opportunity to try a second time. Malygos sought out Nosdormu and the sisters, roaring for their attention. With his head he indicated Galakrond. As weary as they all were, they had to move in close yet again and do what they could to keep the rock lodged. Despite the urgency, Malygos looked back for Neltharion. There was no sign of either the charcoal-gray proto-dragon or his horrific opponents. Malygos hissed, imagining the undead feeding on Neltharion's torn body with such vividness that Kalik could also see it. The hiss grew more angry, more determined. Taking in Galakrond, Malygos thought of not only Neltharion's death, but also those of the monster's previous victims. He dived. The grotesque leviathan's sides heaved rapidly. It seemed impossible to Kalik's host that Galakrond could breathe at all, but some air had to be writhing its way down the throat. Not enough to satisfy Galakrond's needs, but enough to keep him a viable threat. The four of them swarmed the head, each coming in from a different direction. Galakrond kept his head down. His body quivered. Malygos heard a change in the breathing. It was not quite so rapid. If the stone was still stuck, it had at least shifted, giving Galakrond more air. Too late, Kalik's host realized that their monstrous foe had to be more aware of what was happening around him than he was before. As if hearing that thought, Galakrond gazed skyward. He took in the four tiny fingers. "Little morsels," Galakrond somehow managed. "I will eat you when I can." He coughed violently, but at the same time his wings flapped wildly, not to fly but to purposely keep his enemies away. The wings did that to Ysera and Alexstrasza, but not to Malygos and Nosdormu. Nosdormu seized hold of one webbed wing and, perhaps too out of breath to exhale at the head, ran his claws over the wing's membrane. The claws cut deep, proving that there were some parts of Galakrond's skin that were not impervious. Galakrond's coughing ceased. He angrily snapped at Nosdormu, giving Malygos the opening he desired. The only hope remaining was keeping Galakrond's airway from clearing. Malagos knew he could have ensured that earlier. Instead, he had let his natural survival instincts take over. He had fled the behemoth's jaws rather than doing what must be done. The rock could never be dislodged if another large object kept it wedged in tighter. Malagos intended to be that wedge, although doing so might well promise his destruction along with that of Galakrond, considering the great height from which they would plummet. Kalak too understood the need for the sacrifice and welcomed it. He still had slight memories or imaginings of some life beyond that as an unnoticed portion of Malagos, but those only pained him, for they hinted at someone lost to the blue dragon, someone fading farther away. "Let us die saving this world," he told Malagos, even though his words continued to be unheeded. "Let us die." Rising on his hind legs, Galakrond set one smaller forepaw against the nearest peak. Even the forepaw had the strength to crush rock and pack dirt as if they were loose sand. The wings continued to flap, yet not only did Nozdormu cut deeper ribbons in the one, but Alexstrasza and Ysera also attempted to do the same with the other. The attacks by the three probably would have been insignificant if Galakrond had been able to breathe properly, but as it was, they further disoriented the half-suffocating beast. But then an unsettling gurgling noise escaped Galakrond. It was followed by a raspy breath that extended several seconds too long for Malagos' comfort. That Galakrond could breathe so well could only mean that he had the rock nearly dislodged. More than ever, Malagos saw the need for his choice. The others were doing as originally planned, keeping their gigantic foe distracted for the critical blow. They just did not realize exactly how their chosen leader had decided to make that final assault. The jaws were open just wide enough. Malagos took a fleeting measure of the gap and thought that Galakrond appeared to have slightly shrunken again. The behemoth's growth and transformation had become more chaotic, likely because of the diet that had perverted his shape in the first place. Malagos tightened his approach. Pushing his momentum as hard as he could, he folded his wings against his body and darted inside. Galakrond's fetid breath enveloped him, and hints of the foul mist threatened to dull Malagos' mind before he could commit himself. He saw the rock, now halfway out and leaning to one side. Galakrond tried to shift it with the back of his tongue, creating more complications for the much smaller proto-dragon. The icy blue male collided with the stone, shoving it deeper. That, though, caused an instantaneous reaction from Galakrond, who shook his head with greater violence and tried to exhale. Undeterred, Malagos dug into the back of the behemoth's tongue and shoved against the stone, sending it as far in as he could. A sudden tremor shook Malagos, but it was nothing that Galakrond had done. Something had struck Galakrond hard in the skull, with such force that the head still reverberated. Malagos saw that working to his advantage. With his monstrous opponent so otherwise occupied, Kalak's hosts exhaled at the area around the stone. The harsh frost sealed the stone in place, at least for the moment. Both Malagos and Kalak knew that the heat generated by Galakrond would quickly overwhelm the frost. Malagos had merely wanted to give himself time to adjust his position. Seeking air yet again, Galakrond opened his mouth wider. Malagos eyed the opening, the temptation to fly out of the beast a very reasonable one. Still he knew that he had to stay. A whirling form barreled into Galakrond's mouth. It quickly proved to be not one thing, but rather two. One of those things was a battered and ravaged undead, which at first made Kalak and his host fear that Galakrond had come up with the startling plan of sending his puppets in to do what he himself could not. Yet while the potential for that only now occurred to them, it was not the case, for the second object was clearly very much alive. Battered and bruised, scratched but not showing any signs of having been bitten, Neltharion bared his teeth in a grin at the sight of Malagos. Fly away, the charcoal gray male insisted. Malagos peered at his own handiwork. The frost was already melting. A sudden dip nearly sent them tumbling into the jagged teeth and also showed much jostling by the rock. Must stay, he shouted back. You go. All fight together. One family. Neltharion glared at the rock as he swatted the still struggling corpse. I will keep it in. You go. But Malagos instead leapt at Neltharion, or rather, the ripped and torn undead. He seized the flailing body by the throat, twisting the neck so that the claws and the teeth could not threaten him. Galakrond shook back and forth. Malagos and Neltharion had just enough room to flutter up into the air, keeping them from being affected very much. Malagos launched himself toward the rock again, carrying the animated corpse with him. The rock began to slide. The upper part of the mouth suddenly loomed in Malagos's path as Galakrond dipped his head down to aid his breathing. Kalak's host corrected. The undead struggled to free itself. Malagos shook his foul catch hard, then sent it tumbling forward. The ghoulish creature collided with the rock, shoving it slightly deeper, but that was not Malagos's full intention. He bent his hind legs forward, ready to push as hard as he could. "Move!" Malagos veered off just in time. Neltharion, hind paws bent forward in the same manner as his friend, crashed against both the undead and the stone. With a force that Malagos could not have possibly mustered, Neltharion jammed the bony figure and the rock deep into Galakrond's gullet. Teeth slammed against Malagos as Galakrond reacted. A muffled roar still almost deafened him. Malagos, seeking to avoid the rippling tongue, collided with Kalak's host. Malagos hurtled out of the side of the mouth. Oh, Neltharion. "Neltharion, he's still inside!" It was impossible to say whether the thought first originated from Malagos or Kalak, but the blue dragon found himself astounded that he, who could yet recall some bits of his supposed future, would want to rescue a creature who would in turn threaten Azeroth. Yet when Malagos immediately arced back, Kalak cheered him on. Neltharion lay sprawled on his back, trying to right himself, despite the mad swinging of Galakrond's head and the writhing tongue. If not for the fact that the passage was blocked, Neltharion would have been swallowed twice. Galakrond's jaws snapped shut. Malagos feared for his companion, but the mouth opened again. Neltharion had managed to turn onto his stomach, but he had still not regained his balance. Dodging teeth larger than him, Malagos soared back inside. Hind paws ready, he seized Neltharion by the shoulders and pushed on without hesitation. Neltharion went limp in his grip, but only to keep from distracting Malagos. The jaws started to close again. With another beat of his wings, Malagos pulled himself tightly together. The two proto-dragons returned to the outside just as the jaws shut. Neltharion stirred to life, and Malagos, barely able to hold on, let him go. The two exhausted males did not go far, instead banking together and returning to the aid of their comrades. But both pulled up short at the sight before them. Alexstrasza, Ysera, and Nosdormu no longer sought to keep Galakrond occupied. It did not just have to do with the fact that Malagos and Neltharion were no longer in danger. Simply staying near Galakrond was to invite doom. The gargantuan proto-dragon thrashed wildly, ravaging the nearby mountains and sending one avalanche after another down on the areas below. His tail and wings flailed through the air, striking other mountainsides, and creating a wind that buffeted the smaller proto-dragons even as far away as where they were. Galakrond's hacking and choking reached epic proportions. To the shock of Kalak and his host, Galakrond struck his head against one peak in what was evidently a more desperate attempt to dislodge the rock. Malagos feared that he would have succeeded, but all that happened was that Galakrond shook his head again as if to clear it. As he did that, his furious gaze fell upon Malagos. Galakrond rose into the air, the icy blue male his target. Malagos had no choice but to turn and flee, and hope. Yet barely had he done so when a tremendous thud made him look back. Rather than pursuing Malagos, Galakrond had abruptly banked to the south. He crashed into the top of a mountain and tumbled over it. Malagos considered continuing his flight, but Galakrond's next action put an end to such thoughts. Galakrond managed to rise into the air, but his path turned more erratic. Twice he dropped on top of peaks, destroying their crowns before he succeeded in staying aloft. Yet it seemed as if Galakrond no longer even noticed Malagos and the others. He moved on to the south, past the mountains to the bleak stretches beyond, as if some key to his struggle for breath could be found there. Fearful that such might be the case, Malagos finally dared to pursue the behemoth. Neltharion and the rest joined him. They all knew that if Galakrond was free to breathe, their own deaths would very likely soon follow. Galakrond fluttered over the wasteland, his path meandering. His body was aglow again, but now as if aflame. Several of the extraneous appendages shriveled. From a distance, Galakrond almost looked like a true proto-dragon once more, albeit a huge one. And then he simply dropped. The land below shook with his collision. The shock was expanding for miles. Shock wave. Crevasses spread all around where Galakrond hit. Cracks that looked like lightning bolts coursing along the ground. No sooner had he hit than Galakrond shoved skyward once more. He managed to rise as high as one of the lower mountains in the distance, then fell again. While his crash did not reverberate as much as the last one had, it was no less dramatic, for it was quickly followed by the Leviathan's manic flailing on the ground. All the while, Galakrond coughed and hacked. His eyes stared but no longer appeared to see. He pushed himself up, beating his wings harder. Somehow Galakrond managed to keep going until at last he hovered higher than ever. His wings ceased flapping. The coughing also stopped, but only because Galakrond was no longer trying to breathe. To Kalik and his host, it appeared that Galakrond remained frozen in the air. The gigantic proto-dragon hung before them, wings spread to their full length. The illusion faded as Galakrond dropped like a stone, his massive body spiraling, tail first. When he struck this time, the force threw up a cloud of snow and dust that briefly obscured everything. Malygos managed to make out the silhouette as Galakrond's head swung down after the rest of his body had hit. The great head smashed into the empty landscape so forcefully that the neck snapped and the skull tilted at an odd angle, at which point the lower jawbone also broke off. And only then, only as the dust cleared enough for the five to see, and when it no longer mattered for Galakrond, the rock and the grisly remains tumbled free through the ruined jaws. They came to rest several yards away, insignificant in size compared with the creature they had helped bring down. Galakrond was dead. All right, so epic battle underway. We knew it had to happen. We knew Galakrond had to wind up dead. And we knew the 5 dragon aspects were going to survive. I was kind of thinking that they might become the aspects after some time, so maybe we'll get that in the final chapter. All right, cool, and we'll discuss the overall story at that point as well. Hey, I thank everybody so much for watching, for listening. I hope that you enjoyed it. We got another episode in the pipe 5x5, and I hope to see everybody on the next episode of Lore of Warcraft.